What is going on, guys? This is Skyhound, also known as Geek Archivist Xavier Pierce. And today we actually have a really special um, review that I'm doing. I know I'm not going to be the only one going over this. I know many of us were around during the time when this film came out, as you can see by the banner here, as well as when I was starting the recording. It is the 30th anniversary of The Lion King. Now, each of us remember when, how old we were when we watched this. Some of us were really young, like myself. Me being a 90s kid, I was born in the late 80s. If you want an exact number, I was born in 1988. This film came out in 1994. So if you do simple mathematics, you already figured out how old I was when this came out. Now, I want to point out a few things, but before I do, if you like what you hear and see, do hit that like and subscribe button. So, what I want to point out about this film is that later on, as I started to grow a bit older, I picked up really quickly in terms of a few nuances in terms of literature to an extent. Not most of the classic literature, but a few here and there. What am I getting at? The sequel to this film, Simba's Pride, that came out some years later, that one I knew had references to the whole Romeo and Juliet type of story. Now, in the case of this film, the original Lion King, this was actually based on, if memory serves me right, I am pretty certain it was Hamlet. That was roughly what this was based on. So the premise of this film is pretty basic. We have the birth of a young cub who is eventually going to be the heir apparent to Pride Rock. And Mufasa and Nala, I mean not Nala, Sarabi. Sorry, I'm flipping out here. Sarabi and Mufasa, my gosh, it's been years since I've watched this, are celebrating the birth of their son. And, Rafiki is actually going through the usual motions of, considering it's, royalty and, how to put this? Just the usual motions. But the thing is that most of the animals who are actually the subjects in this case knew about this birth of, this this heir, if you will, and so they all attend the celebration. The only one that doesn't attend the whole thing was Scar, and we find out that he is the brother of Mufasa in this case, and there's a point where he's playing around with his food, and it's actually a chinchilla mouse. So by the time Zazu comes in, it runs off, and Zazu's going off like, "Didn't your mother ever tell you not to play with your food?" And he tells Scar, "I'm here to announce that King Mufasa is on his way, so you better have a good excuse for not attending the ceremony." And Scar is not amused with the banter that Zazu is coming from because he of course is banished and all of that. Just as he has Zazu in his mouth, Mufasa comes in roughly a second later, and then you see Zazu's beak popping out. He's like, "Impeccable timing, Your Majesty." So as he's spit out by Scar, Scar obviously is mockingly greeting his brother and saying, "Why, if it isn't my big brother descending from on high to mingle with the commoners?" And Mufasa points out what Zazu said a while ago. "Sarabi and I didn't see you at the presentation of Simba." And of course, again, Scar feigns innocence. He's like, "That was today. Oh, I feel simply awful. It must have slipped my mind. And here is where things get interesting is where Zazu says, well, as slippery as your mind is, as the king's brother, you should have been first in line. And Scar obviously replies back, I was first in line until the little hairball was born. To which, of course, Mufasa replies back, I mean, as much as I want to go through scene by scene, I'm just going from what I recall. But the story is pretty straightforward. Mufasa replies back, stating, that hairball is my son and your future king. So as Scar is turning his back, Mufasa is like, don't turn your back on me, Scar. But the interesting thing is Scar goes, oh no, Mufasa, perhaps you shouldn't turn your back on me. And not only does this really anger Mufasa, and he's asking him, is that a challenge? Scar pretty much explains that Mufasa is all bronze, whereas he has the smarts, and he simply points out to Zazu, why he decides not to challenge him. He says, "Well, as far as the lion's share go, as far as brains go, I have the lion's share. But when it comes to brute strength, and he emphasizes this though, as he's glaring at Mufasa, I'm afraid I'm at the shallow end of the gene pool. I don't know why I said dream. I said gene pool. So he's lamenting the fact that he doesn't have, the exact brute strength that Mufasa has, but Scar has the brains. And eventually we get to the point where Rafiki is in his tree and he eventually Christians the name of the cub that was born and he goes by Simba. So we see Simba eventually waking up and he's asking, his dad who's still asleep, about the lesson that he was supposed to be learning. I apologize if my internet kind of goes in and out, but it happens. And Simba is nagging his dad numerous times, and Sarabi's like, "Don't tell me you forgot, about what you're supposed to be doing." And Mufasa's like, "Before the sun rises, he's your son." I think I don't remember who said it though, but I know that was one of the lines. Eventually, he relents and wakes up, and he's telling Simba that you know the sun will eventually set on his time, and he's telling him, everything that the sun touches belongs to them, except for a certain shadow area. And Mufasa's telling him um, that is beyond their borders, and that he's trying to teach his son, that there's boundaries, that you're allowed certain areas save for there. And Simba is assuming that, you get to do whatever you want. Okay, again, sorry, like I said, connection issues, it happens. But anyway, Mufasa is pointing out to Simba that there's more to being a king than getting your way. And he's saying to him about the whole thing regarding the circle of life, that everything exists in a delicate balance, and that as a king, you need to respect that balance, and that all the other animals, despite them being, they're subjects and commoners in the sense, he still has to respect that, despite the fact he is the son of a king, and that despite there being a hierarchy, there should be not just a mutual understanding, but like I said again, roughly the third time I said it, there is respect between, individuals. Now, there is a little tidbit that I will share before I go on any further. I do recall when they did do the Broadway version of this film, eventually they did do a tour. And I do recall roughly, I would say I was in my early teens when I watched it. I watched it with my dad only once, and it was held at the Pantages Theater. So when they released this film again on DVD, they added parts of the musical, considering this is a musical in a way. They added some bits, like, for example, the morning report. That was not in the original release. That was in the musical. But again, this was a re release of the film, and they added that part in there. So I will say this, that when I did watch it, I definitely enjoyed it because it was not just a rough retelling of the same story, but you get to see how they use not just the puppets, but also the way how the actors who voiced the characters and also played them, how they took it to a slightly Shakespeare type level in a way, but still retain that, um, which is of the animated film itself. So it respects it, but also does a faithful representation of the medium itself, not just from a literary perspective, but also what inspired it, if you will. So anyway, it gets to a point where um, Mufasa sees his son trying to, catch something, and he's asking him, what are you doing, son? Pouncing. And as Zazu is kind of giving his report and all of that, Mufasa's like, let me show you an old pro how it's done. And as Zazu keeps mouthing off, he's like, Zazu, can you turn around, please? And he's like, yes, sire. And so he's going off on his report. And this is where it gets fun. And kudos to James Earl Jones for doing the character super well. Like the guy was born to do this. And Zazu is asking, Mufasa, what's going on? And he's like, a pouncing lesson. And Zazu, of course, is going, oh, very good, pouncing. And then he's like, pouncing? Oh, sorry, you can't be serious. Oh. And he's going with his boys, like, turn around, go on. And Mufasa's, coaching his son on, posture and all that. And Zazu's like, what are you telling him, Mufasa? And he's looking around and he's freaking out at the same time. I think it took about maybe 5, 6 seconds, give or take, before Simba manages to land a good hit on him. To Mufasa's, delight, at least. But after that lesson, Zazu learns that hyenas have infiltrated the Pride Lands, and Simba wants to join in, but Mufasa telling him, unfortunately, you can't join for specific reasons. Unfortunately, when how do I put this? Despite Simba being unable to join, and he obviously has to relent to his father's rule and all of that, he does eventually visit his uncle Scar, and despite you know um, despite the lesson that he was taught a while ago, um, Scar kind of points out and kind of twists the words, if you will, when Simba tells Scar he's not allowed to go to that area beyond the Pride Lands. Scar's like, and he's absolutely right. It's far too dangerous. Only the bravest of lions go there. And Simba's going, well, I'm brave. What's out there? And Scar doesn't quite actually give him an idea in terms of like a reason and all that, but he does tell him, you know, he has a little secret to share with them. So eventually, Simba does meet up with Nala, who obviously is getting a bath, and then Simba's mother Sarabi does the same with him, and Nala's going like, "So where exactly are we going? It better not be someplace boring." And Simba has to, of course, lie to Sarabi and the other lionesses. He says we're going to like the watering hole, but as they're going along, Simba eventually spills the beans and says they're heading over to the elephant graveyard. But Zazu kind of overhears stuff, and he thinks that, considering how young they are, that eventually they would get married. And Simba's like, why would I marry her? She's my best friend. And even though he's young, he doesn't quite fully grasp the situation in terms of, guys liking girls and all of that stuff. And despite him being young, he thinks that, if he was king, that he'd be able to um, make certain amendments when he really doesn't quite fully understand the weight of the position and all that. But anyway, both of them do manage to distract Zazu long enough with the whole song of "I Just Can't Wait to Be King." I'm not gonna go list every single song, but for those of us who have watched it, we know what it is. Eventually, they do make their way to the elephant graveyard, and we are met by the three hyenas. Shenzi being one, Banzai being another, and Ed being the last one. So, unfortunately, when Zazu actually does catch up with them, um, basically with the three of them kind of like being like outside the Pride Land territory, I will say that in terms of writing, kudos to the three voice actors who actually played, or at least not two. I mean, not three, two of them. I misspoke there. Two of the voice actors who did Banzai and Shenzi. The jokes were definitely good. I'll give the script writers that. And there's one part that's hilarious that doesn't get old, where Banzai is going, "Hey, did we order this dinner to go?" As Ed is pointing out that they're running away, and Shenzi is like, "No, why?" And Banzai eventually is letting them know that they're escaping. But when they do eventually catch up with them, unfortunately, Mufasa does find out their whereabouts, and he gives the three hyenas a good thrashing, and he's telling them, "If you ever come near my son again, you know what's going to happen to you." What he doesn't realize is that Scar is watching from a distance, and Simba tries to apologize, but of course Mufasa is really ticked off at him, and despite not trying to be supportive of him, Zazu is forced to take Nala one way, and Mufasa has to teach his son literally a lesson, and he really gives him an earful, where he's basically telling him, I might as well try to paraphrase the best I can. He tells him that he's very disappointed in him. "You deliberately disobeyed me. And what's worse, you put Nala in danger." And Simba obviously tries to reason out with his father the reason why he did what he did. He said, "I was just trying to be brave like you. I'm only brave when I have to be. Being brave doesn't mean going looking for trouble." And Simba eventually learns that kings get scared, and his father was afraid of losing him. But obviously, after the whole apology situation, um, Simba is going, "But you know what? But I bet those hyenas were even scareder, and Mufasa is going, "Because nobody messes with your dad." And then Mufasa gives him a very important lesson with regards to looking at the stars. And he's telling him that the great kings of the past look down on us from those stars. So whenever you feel alone, just remember that those stars will always be there to guide you, and so will he. So it cuts over to the Badlands, and obviously Scar does kind of like outline his plan of trying to kill his own brother Mufasa. And the interesting thing about this, when you look at the scenery in terms of what um, the song "Be Prepared" does emphasize, historically speaking, I'm gonna slide off a little bit here. We get a reference to like not just communism and the like, with the way how Scar is standing like all proud and all of that. His hyenas are kind of like you know communist army and all of that. But you see the parallels there. So eventually it gets to a point where Scar does mention that he does have a surprise for Simba. What he doesn't realize, Simba in this case, he doesn't realize that he's about to supposedly get killed. And the hyenas, at least a few of them, start a stampede. And one of the things that Scar mentions is that, Simba's asking him before it starts, of course, is, "Hey, Uncle Scar, will I like this surprise?" And it's this response that kind of makes it clear. Simba, it's to die for. And eventually, once the stampede does start, Simba manages to barely hang on to safety. And when Scar mentions about to Mufasa about the stampede, Mufasa doesn't realize that he's being tricked. And so, even though he does save his son, Mufasa's looking at his brother Scar and he's asking him for his help until Scar points out, "Long live the king," after he does grab him, but then he then literally pushes him off. And of course, when Simba is trying to runs over to his father, he doesn't realize that he's dead. But then Scar pins the blame on him, on Simba, and he's asking him, "What should he do? Run away and never return?" Then, of course, we see the main three hyenas, and Scar tells him to kill him. Of course, Simba does manage to get away, but eventually he collapses near a desert, where, of course, he runs into Timon and Pumbaa. And then he eventually lives for a bit in the jungle, and then grows his into adulthood, of course. But what he doesn't realize is that as a result of him running away, Scar does, in a way, usurp the throne, breaks the news, lies about Simba, and then, obviously, under Scar's rule, um, the Pride Lands are now what they once were. So Nala eventually is out hunting him one time, and then Pumbaa is kind of like um, walking around in the tall grass, but doesn't realize that Nala is chasing him, and Timon's looking for him. And by the time Pumbaa does reach out to Timon, and he's saying that he's about to be eaten, that's when Simba enters the fray. But he doesn't realize that when Nala pins him down, that's when the memories start to come back, and both recognize each other. But what Timon and Pumbaa don't realize is that those two are eventually going to be falling for each other, and they do. But When Nala tries to convince Simba to come back to the Pride Lands after what happened, that's when, unfortunately, the two have a bit of a quarrel, if you will. And Simba shuts Nala out of his so-called problems, and um, this is where Rafiki eventually comes in. And before I go on any further, there's a little tidbit I want to point out with regards to the lines that are said by Rafiki as Simba is kind of like slightly depressed. And it has to do with the whole Asante sana squash banana line. And the full line, of course, is in Swahili. That's one of the languages over in Africa. So I'm going to be referencing from a blog that I found. The actual line is Asante sana squash banana wewe nugumimi hapana. And the only thing that is mentioned, and they kind of like rearrange the words here, we find out that Asante sana means many things. So the only part that they mention is, or at least Rafiki says to Simba, um, it means you're a baboon and I'm not. That's roughly what it means, but the actual translation is roughly you are a baboon and I'm not. I'll put the link in the description below if you guys want to take a look at it. And Simba is kind of like going, why even following me around? And, it gets to a point where Simba's like, and I suppose you know who I am. And Rafiki's like, oh, I know who you are. You're Mufasa's boy. And this, of course, eventually stops Simba as he's trying to leave. And then Rafiki's, running off. And there's a point where Simba's like, you know my father? And of course, Rafiki corrects him and saying, correction, I know your father. And when Rafiki is telling him to like look um, at where he's trying to lead him, and he's, Simba's telling Rafiki that his father's dead, but Rafiki refutes him, stating that no, he's actually alive, and I'll show him to you. So he leads Simba to a small pond, and he's telling him to look in the water. And there's a moment before I go any further about this animated version of it. In the Broadway version, there is a song called He Lives in You. And basically, Rafiki is telling Simba that you inherited stuff from your father. So despite him not being physically around, he's still within your heart. And, he's basically telling him that he lives in you. So we get to a point where Simba does see his father's ghost, and Mufasa is pointing out to him, you need to remember who you are, that you are my son, the one true king, and you need to go back to the Pride Lands. And there's a really good point that never gets old, where Rafiki hits him on the head with his stick, and he's like, what was that? It doesn't matter. It's in the past. Yeah, but it still hurts. Ah, yes, the past can hurt. But the way I see it is you can either run from it or learn from it. And he tries to swing at him again. And at this point, Simba manages to dodge it, to which Rafiki's like, okay, at least I understand. He's like, you see? So what are you going to do? First, I'm going to take your stick. And he does grab it and then just tosses it out to the side. To which Rafiki's asking him, hey, where are you going? And Simba simply points out, I'm going back. And eventually, Nala, Timon, and Pumbaa learn from Rafiki that Simba decides to go back. But the way Nala tries to break the news to Timon and Pumbaa, it takes a while. So by the time Simba does return back to the Pride Lands, what Nala said earlier in their quarrel turns out to be true. And by the time um, Simba does confront Scar, they think that Simba actually did kill his father. But the truth is that Scar is the one that did it, which of course angers Simba, and eventually a really big fight breaks out. To which, of course, Simba does gain the upper hand, and so does his allies. But when Scar is looking at the hyenas, he originally tells Simba that it was their idea, not his, because he's lying, of course. They catch wind of it, and they're really peeved at Scar. So when he says, "Ah, my friends," Shenzi's like, "Friends? I thought he said we were the enemy." And Banzai goes, "Yeah, that's what I heard." And so eventually, Scar does meet his end. And when Simba does, takes his place as the new king, eventually, Pride Rock flourishes again. And it is here where we get to the end of the film. Again, I'm just going through as much as I can, in a certain amount of time, because I know I'm not the only one who's going to be covering it. There are going to be others. Overall, this is definitely one of my favorites. In the top 5 for sure. Story-wise, I'd give it a 9 out of 10 because it does reference, classic literature and all of that. Music, definitely 10 out of 10. Characters, definitely, a 9 out of 10. And it's definitely one of those ones where it's rewatchable. And before I finish, I do want to point out I am going to bash a little bit on the live action take because most of us know it is stupid. And you have the one who did most of the music for The Lion King, Elton John. He himself did bash the living daylights out of the live action take. And I say respect for that. He is correct on that regard, that it has no soul. It is nothing like the original because he did help with writing the songs, at least some of them. So he knows what he's talking about because he's worked on it. The people that did this live action take did not understand the film. And before I forget, I want to also say rip to the original voice actor who played Rafiki. But anyway, this has been Skyhound, also known as Geek Archivist Pierce. Stay safe, stay sane, and stay humble.